You're listening to the Business for Good podcast, the show where you'll hear inspirational stories about companies making money by solving some of the world's most pressing problems. I'm your host, Paul Shapiro, and I'm glad you've joined us. Hello, friend, and welcome to episode number 151 of the Business for Good podcast. That, of course, suggests there are 150 back episodes, most of which are evergreen and are fantastic for you to listen to. So make sure that if you're just tuning in for the first time, you go back and check out the catalog because there's a lot of inspiration here in these past 150 episodes. I always love hearing feedback from listeners, and I was especially glad to get such positive feedback on our last episode, episode 150, with Polybion, the company in Mexico using bacteria to make alternative leather. It was really cool, and I was glad to have them on the show. But in this episode, we're moving from Mexico to the Middle East, where Israel has become a mecca of sorts for food tech and animal-free food tech in particular. Our guest in this episode has been helping foment this food revolution in Israel for the past decade, and it is my pleasure to have him on this show. Around the time that his son was born in 2011, Beni Nofech saw a video that changed his life. After listening to an argument about the need to move away from the view that animals are mere commodities for humanity to use however we like, Beni adopted a vegan diet and soon found himself attending animal protection movement and alt-protein conferences. From there, he began making angel investments in food tech startups that could help animals, eventually leading him to leave his career in the medical device world to become a full-time venture capitalist in the alternative protein and food tech world. Today, Beni runs Milk and Honey Ventures, an 8-figure investment fund with a mandate to place early-stage bets on Israeli food tech startups that are seeking to displace animals in the food system. He's backed some of the biggest names in alt protein, including many of the companies who've been on this podcast before. In the show, Beni and I discuss the state of alt protein investing, whether he views the current apparent malaise as permanent or transitory, and what he sees for the future of this important industry. I've known Beni since 2016 and can attest that he is a great guy with important insights from which anyone who cares about building a better food system will benefit. So now I bring you Beni Nofech. Beni, welcome to the Business for Good podcast.
Hey, Paul. Thanks for having me. It's so great to be here with you.
It's my pleasure. First, let me say Mazel Tov. It was your son's bar mitzvah just this weekend. We're recording this in September of 2024. And I want to know, how was this bar mitzvah?
That's correct. Thank you so much, Paul. It was great. You know, it's good to have, in Hebrew, we call it a simcha. It's good to have a reason to celebrate, especially now with everything going on around us. So it was a good opportunity to, spend some time with family and friends and celebrate, this event of this little man marching into manhood. This is part of the Jewish tradition, and we're very happy to have celebrated this.
Hey, very nice. So a lot of the times the bar mitzvahs in the United States are these very big affairs, right? They cost a lot of money. There's a lot of people. I've heard it's not always the same in Israel. However, tell me, what was your son's bar mitzvah like? Was this one of those big blowout affairs?
Oh, no. That, first of all, it's not really how we roll. But I also think that in this special year with everything going on in Israel, we didn't feel that it was, the right moment to make a big celebration. So we had something very modest with family and friends. And, we had the ceremony and then a dinner. And that's it pretty much.
Okay.
Very, very warm and touching.
Well, congratulations to you and to your family. That's so fantastic. That's really nice. So I remember you telling me once, Beni, that you got interested in plant-based eating and actually stopped eating animals around the time that your son here was born, like 13 years ago. Isn't that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Is there a causal correlation between your son's birth, or is it just coincidental?
That's a great question. Actually, I turned vegan, I think something around like a couple of months after my son was born. That was in 2011. And it was probably related. What happened, and I know that you're familiar with the subject, is that I got exposed to Gary Rovsky's talk online. And 40 minutes after, I was vegan for life and an activist. So in part, it was Gary Yourofsky. In part, it was me looking at this baby next to me, while I'm in this process of of realizing and learning about the harmful effects of industrial animal farming and asking myself what kind of world he's going to grow into. So yes, it probably had a lot of influence on me happening around that time. But to be honest, when I watched Gary Yourofsky's speech, it already struck a personal chord with me because I did have a bit of history with animals and specifically farmed animals. So growing up in Jerusalem in Israel, I always had pets at home. We're an animal loving family. I had cats, dogs, fish, turtles, hamsters. I had it all. I also volunteered as a kid in a veterinarian clinic around the corner from us, cleaning the tables, cleaning after the animals, feeding the animals. And I also worked as an assistant to the vet actually after my military service. But before my military service, I was in a program called Garin Nachal here in Israel, where you basically go and volunteer in the kibbutz. I don't know if you're familiar with this concept, but it's like a community that kind of shares their ventures together, and a kind of socialist kind of community. And a lot of them are agricultural communities. And when we lived there, out of my love to animals, I remember the day when they asked who wants to work in the dairy farm. And I volunteered gladly to do so because I loved animals, right? And I worked there for 4 months. And now in retrospect, I know that this period had a lot of influence on me, but I didn't make the cognitive connection between what we were doing there in the dairy farm and what I thought, I felt and thought about animals. And I think that when I saw Gary's speech, I think it was, what was it? It was 13 years later. Yeah, again, 13. That kind of struck that chord again. And then I was like, I was listening to the speech and I thought, hey, that's interesting. That's a new perspective that I never thought about. And that's when I started really digging into what's going on in the wider animal agriculturalist industry. And, just tumbling down that rabbit hole, the more I learned about it, the more I realized that there's a very, very serious problem with how we raise animals for food on this planet. And that was a pivotal moment for me.
It's amazing how many times I talk with people from Israel and ask them what their catalyst was for getting involved in the plant-based or animal protection movements. And that talk just comes up over and over again. And we'll link to it in the show notes for this episode at businessforgood.com. But it's interesting because Gary did not give that talk in Israel. It's not directed at an Israeli audience. I think it was actually in the state of Georgia in the United States.
But Caltech, yeah.
Oh, okay. Caltech. Well, anyway, it's not particularly aimed at Israel, but for some reason, this talk had a very big afterlife in Israel and influenced a lot of people. And,
it went viral, and we call this generation of plant-based vegan activists Gary baby generation. So there are a lot of Gary babies walking around Israel.
Okay, that's really funny. Well, now that Gary baby has been bar mitzvahed and and he's now a man. Okay, listen, I want to just get to a very provocative question right off the bat here. So my recollection is that you and I first met in 2017 at Technion University in Haifa, right? At that conference, it was like a culture meet symposium. Is that right?
No, we actually met before. I think it was 2016 at the first New Harvest conference in San Francisco.
Good memory. I actually, now that you're saying this, I now remember this. Okay, great. So, all right. So that's, first of all, thank you for correcting my error. I remember meeting you there, and I was so excited. I was so excited to meet you, actually. But I have a photo of us together in 2017, and that's what must have made me think it was 2017. But either way,
we actually appear on the big photo of the first New Harvest conference, with the big crowd over there on the lawn.
Oh, yes, I remember that.
Yeah. I'm in the first row, actually. Look me up.
Okay. All right. Cool. I will, for sure. Okay. So listen, go back to 2017. You and I meet in San Francisco. There's a lot of enthusiasm for what would soon be called cultivated meat, although back then was being called cultured meat. And, you came all the way from Israel to California to go to this conference. And so many people, including you and I, were very excited about this. If somebody had told you 8 years later, in 2024, there will be essentially no cultivated meat being sold, just a couple symbolic things, but really there's no meaningful market penetration. Would you have been surprised, or would you have thought, I don't think that there'll be anything really on the market within 8 years?
That's a great question. To be honest, when I think back on the way I perceived the evolution of this industry back then, I had to answer this question quite a lot. And, people said, how long do you think before we're gonna be able to show returns in this industry or exits or actually proof of concept with products on the market, as you say?
Yeah. How about just revenue? How about just revenue?
Just revenue, exactly. and my answer was and still is that first of all, I'm trying to look at it as a long-term player. I think that this industry is inevitable, and this was also part of the reason why I went all in when I did on this industry, because I understood that essentially we're talking about an engineering problem that will be solved if you throw enough time and money on it. What I mean is that it just makes so much sense, to feed the cells directly than to feed it through another system. And when you understand that, and you understand that it's just a matter of when and not a matter of how, then if it's 5 years before, 5 years later, I'm less concerned about that. To be honest, when I'm looking at the industry today, I'm actually positively surprised because I know intimately about some of the amazing technologies that have been developed over the last years in this industry. And I think that we are just now in a very interesting moment in this industry where we, get out of the lab and start building production capacity. And I'm very excited actually about this shift and seeing products hitting the market very soon in terms of, years probably. But I was never a part of the industry who said that it's coming and it's right around the corner in a big way. I like to underpromise and overdeliver.
Right. Okay. That's interesting. I think I would have been surprised. I never said, oh, this is right around the corner. This is going to be some major impact. But I would have been surprised if there was so little on the market by now, to be honest with you. I write about this in the updated edition of Clean Meat that came out in 2024, the paperback. But, in short, I think that some people, perhaps myself included, underestimated the time that it would take in order to bring these products to market in a meaningful way. I would have thought that it would be more similar to where plant-based meat is today, meaning, it still hasn't captured a huge amount of market share, but it's at least available in supermarkets and grocery stores and so on. But let's go back to 2016 when we first met there in San Francisco, Beni, and ask, what were you doing there? Like, why did you decide to travel across the globe to go to this conference for a pre-revenue, basically non-existent industry? What was the catalyst for you to do that?
Well, so to be honest, the New Harvest Conference was something that was added to my trip. The main goal of my trip was to go to the Animal Rights Conference in Los Angeles. That was like a week before that, or a few days just before that conference in San Francisco. And I went there in order to help fundraise for a crowdfunding campaign that was initiated by Supermeat, which is the first cultivated meat company to incorporate in Israel and actually outside of the United States, if I'm not mistaken, right after Upside Foods, who were Memphis Meats back then, as you know.
And what were you doing for a living then, Beni? I know that you invested in Supermeat. My understanding is you were just like an angel investor for them. You weren't doing venture capital full time at that time, right?
True. No, I wasn't a venture capitalist before. I was actually working in the medical device industry in an Israeli company in a business development role. And I kept that job for a few years while I was very, very interested in accelerating the cultivated meat and plant-based space. And I remember I actually told my workplace that I'm on vacation. And that's how I went to the US to help promote Supermeat's campaign.
Wow.
So I was officially on vacation.
And so you knew about Supermeat just because they had generated some buzz in Israel. Like, I remember when their video came out, like in 2016, if they had this like really viral video that came out, and they raised
on Indiegogo.
And I think they raised like hundreds of thousands. I was one of their donors, or I guess I should say, was I a donor or an investor? I remember I contributed online after seeing the video.
A donor. So yeah, I'll tell you about this campaign. It was actually the first proof of concept in our industry that there's actually demand for cultivated meat. So about 5,000 people bought a voucher for a piece of cultivated meat in the future.
Okay, I'm waiting for my voucher. I'm going to have to tell Ido, the CEO.
I hope I'm not getting in trouble here.
No, I very proudly donated, and I was so excited, and I shared that video. It was absolutely a stellar video. So
so to answer your question, I I'll tell you when I was in 2000, when in 2011 I turned vegan. I didn't understand immediately that the solution would be on the supply side. For a couple of years, I tried to convince people to stop eating animals. I guess a couple of years is a pretty quick time to understand that it's probably futile to try and convince 8 billion people to do so. And when I understood that, and I understood that there are technologies being developed in the world, not in Israel still, that are trying to address this problem from the supply side, I understood that this was the solution. I actually got connected to Supermeat through a common friend of ours, Ken, who was developing, I think it was some kind of workshop for vegan activists. It was called The Next Step, where we just sat and tried to think about what else can we do. And that's where I met somebody from the Modern Agriculture Foundation, which is an Israeli iteration, let's call it, iteration of the Good Food Institute. Essentially, they accelerate, entrepreneurship and research in our field in Israel. And that's when I joined the Modern Agriculture Foundation. And through there, I met Supermeat founders. And back then we weren't the food tech nation yet. There was actually not a lot going on in this field in Israel. They were trying to raise funds. They were telling me that they're working on making real meat outside of the animal's body. And I was just convinced immediately that this is the solution and we need to do anything in our power to get that on the road. And that was essentially my first investment in this field. My own family money, a small check, and that's how I got involved.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned Hen Cohen, because he actually has been staying at my wife's house for like the last 10 days and just left.
Cool.
So very small world. Yeah. Yes, indeed. It's a wonderful Israeli animal advocate who is spending a couple of weeks in the United States right now. But in short, you mentioned, Beni, that Israel was not yet the food tech nation, but it really was the startup nation, right? There was this very popular book, The Startup Nation, about essentially looking at why Israel has become such a progenitor of startups, right? Like if you look around where startups generally are based in the world, it's going to be places like the Bay Area in California, maybe Singapore, but the Middle East has not produced historically a lot, and then all of a sudden you've got this one little dot of Israel where it's actually producing tons of startups, and now it's producing tons of food tech startups, especially those who are seeking to displace animals in the food system. And you have invested in a lot of them, as in fact we've had many of your portfolio companies on this show before. But let me just ask you, why do you think it is? Like, why do you think it is that in a region that has not historically produced a lot of startups and a lot of interest in plant-based eating or helping animals move out of the food economy, why Israel? Well, what do you think they've done that has caused this environment to flourish there?
Yeah, so first of all, Paul, I have to say that you kind of stole my book recommendation. It was Startup Nation.
Okay.
Yeah, by Dan Senor and Saul Singer. It's an amazing book, and I really recommend it because I want people from outside of Israel to really understand, the behind the scenes of the Israeli startup and high tech economy, and be encouraged to come and be involved. So that's my book recommendation. I have a couple of others actually that we can pick up later. But to answer your question specifically on food tech and Israel, I think it's a mix of reasons. So first of all, as mentioned, Israel is a powerhouse in the high tech industry globally. And specifically in the food tech industry, we're only second to the US in number of startups in our field and funds invested in our field. If you look at it per capita, I think we are by very, very far the first. And I think the main reasons for that are, first of all, we had a very strong agri-tech ecosystem here in Israel, a very strong academia that deals with subjects that are adjacent to this industry. There's a lot of government support, active government support through the Israeli Innovation Authority that spawns a lot of startups with competitive advantages from day one. We have a very strong medtech and biotech industries that are also very connected to our industry. And I think that all of these factors together kind of created the perfect breeding ground for startups within the field of cultivated meat, fermentation and plant-based foods. We're also a very small country. So, the hope is always to have the opportunity to commercialize products here in Israel as a first iteration or as a beta site to test them before launching outside of Israel. So this is also something that's pretty attractive for startups in our field. It doesn't happen much because of new food regulation, but it's starting, and I hope that it's gonna, accelerate over the years. And this is why I'm also very optimistic about the future of this industry in Israel. I think we're just getting started. There's a lot of potential, specifically in Israeli academia, with research being done in adjacent fields that can pivot into our field. And so I'm very much looking forward for the years ahead and seeing this industry flourish here in Israel.
You mentioned earlier, Beni, that you are more enthusiastic now than ever about the space in general. And if I talk with, let's say, an investor in clean energy, right, they probably have some favorites, right? They'll say, oh, I'm really into solar, or I'm really into wind, or I'm really into geothermal or nuclear, and so on, right? You've invested in a broad array of technologies, from fungi fermentation, animal cell culture, precision fermentation, and more, right?
Molecular farming, yeah.
Yeah, molecular farming. We had on Palopo on here, who I know you're associated with as well. Mm-hmm. So let me ask you, is there a technology that you view as the most likely to, in the near term, start actually displacing the use of animals?
That's a great question. Well, listen, we're already seeing technologies that in the near and immediate term are replacing quite a bit of animals for food production systems. And that's plant-based, because that was the most easy technology to develop and commercialize. I think that the next big one will probably be fungi fermentation, which you are obviously also involved in. I think that there is so much potential in the fungi world, and specifically in creating a large-scale, continuous liquid state fermentation process. I very much support that, and I think I also heard your announcement a few weeks ago about the continuous process. So congrats on that. Yeah, I think that being able to produce large amounts of biomass with high quality and low cost is the key that will bring a lot of impact to our industry in the short term.
Yeah. So, I agree with you, as evidenced by what I choose to do for a living. But I'll tell you, it's interesting. We in this field oftentimes think about the future is producing all of this food in bioreactors, and it needs to scale up. And when people think about cultivated meat, they think about, well, like right now, the largest reactors growing animal cells for this industry are, a few thousand liters, and they want to get to 20,000. That's what some of these companies are saying. But when we think about fungi fermentation, corn, QUORN, in the UK is already running nearly 1 million liters of bioreactors continuously. Now, you referenced this, but most people listening may not be familiar with what that means. Most of the time when you're running a fermentation, you run what's called a batch fermentation, which is you fill the reactor up, you let the reaction run, and then you harvest it, and then you clean it, and you start all over. But a continuous fermentation means you have a constant feed of nutrients into the reactor and a constant bleed of product coming out of the reactor. This is extraordinarily difficult to achieve, and at scale, where, with hundreds of thousands of liters of capacity, corn is the only company doing this, to my knowledge. And so I have visited there. They have 5 150,000 liter bioreactors. They're each about 40 meters tall. I mean, it's insane to look at these things and to climb them. Bioreactors 40 meters tall that are being run continuously. And I went to KFC in London, and I saw corn on the menu for nearly, not identically, but nearly price parity with the chicken sandwich. And that was absolutely stunning to me, because we think about price parity as this elusive future place that we will one day get to. And yet corn is already doing it in the UK. It's truly an incredible phenomenon.
That's so amazing.
Yeah. And it's evidence that this works. It's not that we have to invent some new technology. Obviously, we want to innovate and continue to create better technology, but it works, and it works today. And corn has been doing it for decades now. Admittedly, fungi fermentation is a lot less difficult than animal cell culture. But this is why I underscore what you said, Beni, which is that I think fungi fermentation, when run in a continuous liquid culture, really does offer the ability to displace very large amounts of animal-based meat. So I'm hoping that more and more goes into this. And obviously my own company, the Better Meat Co., is involved in this, but we're not the only ones, and I'm rooting for the success of the others as well. So with that said, now that I have given my own sermon on behalf of fungi fermentation, of which I am definitely an evangelical, are there others?
I'm with you.
Other things?
I'm saying amen gladly.
All right. Good. Thank you. Are there others? So continuous fungi fermentation inside of bioreactors, that's one. Are there other things that you're particularly enthusiastic about? Now, you and I agree, like cultivated meat is going to be big one day, but maybe not for many years into the future. But are there other things that you think, within the 2020s could really make a big dent in the demand for animal products?
Well, Paul, if we're already mentioning continuous and cultivated meat, I'm very much looking forward to seeing a continuous process at large scales of cultivated meat. And actually, very recently, there was an article published in Nature by Professor Yaakov Nachmias from Believer Meats about his continuous process. And I can tell you also that Supermeat has developed a continuous process. Very, very interesting one. And I'm looking forward to seeing this category, bring proof of concept of scalable, cost-efficient process. I think that would be a watershed moment for our industry.
Indeed. Well, I'm a huge fan of Supermeat, and I love Believer too. I just don't know them as well personally, but I'm a huge fan of Supermeat and the folks there, and I'm very eager to get to try their products sometime. I was supposed to be at Food Tech IL last year, sadly for tragic reasons that obviously had to be postponed, and I was hopeful that it would be this year. Obviously, that is not to be, but maybe next year at Food Tech IL we'll get some Supermeat, do it for tasting.
And
yes.
you don't just need to come to visit for Food Tech IL. You can come visit us regardless.
It's very generous.
You're always welcome.
Thank you. That's very nice of you. Okay. So when you started Milk and Honey Ventures, which if I'm correct is like 2021, right?
Yeah, that was the first
time. Yeah. Okay. So when you started it, it was in the height of the fervor for food tech and plant-based and cultivated. You had lots of money going into the space, very high valuations for companies. And now, 3 years later, the opposite is true. You don't have a lot of money going in. The valuations are very low compared to where they were 3 years ago. And there's just a general malaise about the space, not just cultivated meat, but even plant-based meat too. One, why do you think that is? And two, do you think this is permanent, or do you think it's cyclical and this is going to reverse course and this is just a minor speed bump in the overall trajectory of the alternative protein industry?
Well, I'll start with two. I always call it a speed bump, actually. I think it's just a bump in the road. I think it's cyclical. I don't have a lot of experience. As I told you, I'm not a VC that comes from that industry and knows other industries. I only know my industry, but definitely, I've seen the hype in the beginning of this wave. For me, the watershed moment was the Beyond Meat IPO. I clearly remember how I talked about this industry before, and I clearly remember how a week after my phone didn't stop ringing with people asking me, hey, was this what you were talking about? Is that interesting? Should I buy? So I remember the gold rush and, the investors that came in, a lot of them, not all of them, but that came in, when with the first sign of oil, they are also the investors that got out first with the first sign of trouble. Now, for me, as I said, I don't think it's trouble. I think we're on course developing these technologies. And again, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And I think that once we're going to see a proof of concept, either of production at scale or very large commercialization or another big IPO, that's when the hype will start again, because people will understand that there's something real going on here. Or to quote a friend of mine that's sitting in front of me, it's not science fiction, it's science fact. And once they understand that, I think they'll be coming and again voting with their checkbook. So I'm not worried about that. You're right that there's a malaise today. Valuations are going down. I think it's also a healthy process. Obviously some good companies with good technologies will also get hurt from the public sentiment. But ultimately, I think that the good companies that have runway and have developed a meaningful technology that the industry really needs, I think they will prevail. What we're trying to do in this industry now is kind of thinking how we pass this wave. I always call it, ducking under the wave. Let's take a deep breath and come out of it stronger. So I think that this is kind of the way, at least we're looking at it in the industry, and I'm looking forward for better days soon.
Yeah, I am too. And I think when you look at the two companies that IPO'd to great applause were Beyond Meat and Oatly, right? And they
Hmm.
both were trading at really high multiples over their revenue, like 30x revenue, right? And I mean, I remember Beyond Meat had a few $100 million in revenue and at a market cap of $14 billion, right?
Yeah.
And today the market cap is like closer to 400 million or less with about the same amount of revenue. And so, they've lost over 95% share value. So has Oatly. These are the only two publicly traded companies in the space right now that anybody can look at in the private investment market and say, hey, what are the public comparables? And that's a very difficult place to be. And so I think you're right. We do need some other IPO or IPOs. I don't know from where they would come. Like, it's hard for me to see a company that looks like it might be poised to do that. I was hoping that maybe Impossible or Eat Just or some of these other more mature companies might IPO and have some success on that. But do you have thoughts as to where it might come from? Like, if you were guessing where the next IPO in the alternative protein space might be?
So I wouldn't bet on any specific company or technology, but as we discussed before, I think that the most important thing to show now is that it works. We need to have trucks filled coming out of factories and going to supermarkets. And I think that once we're going to see that and people are going to be able to taste, and this is, by the way, also what happened with Beyond Meat IPO. People were able to go and taste the product and then buy the stock in the evening. So once that's going to happen, I think that investor and obviously consumer confidence will come back.
All right. Well, my fingers are crossed that that happens. And there are a number of companies who I think have really fantastic products. And I would love to see trucks coming out of factories going to supermarkets for them.
Yep.
What a pleasure that would be for sure.
What a sight. Yeah.
Yeah. So, you're invested in so many different ones of these technologies, including Oshi, and we had their CEO Ofek Ron on this show a few episodes ago. And one of the things that he and I discussed, which generated a lot of comment and a lot of feedback from listeners, I want to ask you for your opinion on this too, as an expert in the field. Ofek made the point that he doesn't think that we need to mimic the meat experience. He thinks we just need something that is really good that people would rather eat instead of meat, but it doesn't have to be identical to meat. And we got a lot of feedback. Some people were saying, no, people really want meat. Other people were saying, yeah, I totally agree. It doesn't need to mimic meat. It's not like, if you look at other times that animals have been displaced in the economy, it usually wasn't through mimicry, right? Like Henry Ford didn't invent a mechanical horse that just ran faster. He came up with something that was way better than a horse. Or if you think about, when quill pens were displaced by fountain pens, it's not like somebody came up with a synthetic quill that was cheaper. It was just a metal fountain pen was way better, right? You didn't have to stop and dip your ink or your quill into an inkwell and so on. And so what do you think? Like, do you think that mimicry is the holy grail, or do you think it's an unnecessarily high bar?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's a very high bar, to be honest. A large part of the industry is processed meats, where you don't need to create the entire experience of the animal counterpart product in terms of creating a whole muscle cut or anything like that. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity to create exactly the same gastronomic, nutritional experience of a lot of meat products that are out there today. And I think that it's also key, because if I learned anything, and I learned quite a bit, but if I learned something important in this industry, in the food industry specifically, is that people are very much connected to their culture when they make their food choices. And a lot of people want to keep eating what they're used to, using it in the same way, in the same recipes that they're used to. And I think that this is something that's very important for our industry to deliver, at least in the first iteration of our industry or the first generations of our industry. Over the years, I've obviously also been very excited about the prospect of being able to create new products that are not out there. We've been eating certain types of animals throughout history almost randomly. We've chosen cows and chickens and pigs and sheep because of historical, cultural reasons, and also because, I don't know, they were more adapt to a large scale industry. But once we divorce the animal's physiology and we start, engineering the products by ourselves from the ground up, then yeah, sure, why not create better products that compete on the gastronomic side? Why not create new meat experiences? Maybe types of animals together in one meat cut. I'm very much looking forward to that, but I think that we also need to deliver what people are used to.
Well, one thing that I have fantasized about would be the ultimate hybrid, which is where you would take fungi proteins, animal cell culture cells, and plant-based proteins and combine them all into one product. So you can be eating from the animal kingdom, the plant kingdom, and the fungi kingdom all in each bite.
That's like the sustainable protein assemble cry, right?
Yeah, that's right. I call it like the turducken of alternative protein, right? And for people not familiar, turducken is when it's a particularly revolting dish, I think, where you stuff a chicken inside of a duck, inside of a turkey, and then you eat all three birds at once. I know. The things that humans do are sometimes questionable, but anyway, that sounds like a pretty amazing one that I would really like to try. Mm-hmm. And I will tell you, I agree with nearly everything you said, although I do think my only place I think I would diverge from you is that I do think it is still a high bar to mimic, in that even for ground meat, in that when we at the Better Me Co run a lot of focus groups with the public, and when we feed them blind taste tests between a regular hamburger and a Beyond Burger, it's very easy for them to distinguish it. And Beyond has had huge amounts of money, so it hasn't been so easy to mimic even a ground beef. Now Impossible seems to have done a pretty good job at this. Our focus groups show that Impossible really does, like, quote unquote, fool a lot of people. And there is one test that I do, which I call the Eddie test, which is my dog. And Eddie does not like plant-based meat. And he won't eat a Beyond Burger. If I put it in front of him, he won't eat it. And he would gladly eat a hamburger, though. However, he's very happy to eat Impossible beef. He loves it. And so I thought, and so this is like a great focus group because he's not biased by thinking one of these is plant-based, right? He just thinks these are different foods in front of him. And he actually really likes Impossible. And so I thought it must be the heme, right? Like, it's got to be the heme. But then I gave him Impossible chicken nuggets, which have no heme, and he loves them, but he won't eat any other chicken nuggets, no other brand. And maybe so
the brand.
Yeah, so maybe he has brand loyalty, but I think that Impossible just must be doing something really, really well. He also really likes the Better Meat Co steak. He loves that product, but overall, he's pretty finicky. And so anyway, I usually think if we can get Eddie to eat it, then I know we have a great product at hand. We don't have to do an expensive focus group. We'll just test him out.
I have an even more discerning focus group at home. I have a cat, funnily called Tofu. It's his name. I didn't give him the name. I adopted him as Tofu.
Okay.
And and I also try some products with him. But cats are more difficult, I guess, than Eddie.
Yeah. Were there any that Tofu liked?
Yes, but I'm not going to tell you.
Wow! This is a state secret. Okay.
Yeah. I'm happy to talk about it soon.
Okay, well, I can't wait. I'm looking forward to hearing more about that. But so I presume this is some portfolio company of yours. So let me ask you, Beni, a direct question. You've invested in a lot of companies, and obviously your mandate is solely Israeli companies, but surely you've given a lot of thought as to companies that you wish existed. So what has nobody done yet that you would encourage somebody listening to start on their own and try to achieve?
So again, from a macro perspective, knowing that it's a marathon and not a sprint, I'm always trying to think about how can we make the largest amount of entrepreneurs start and upstart companies that have influence in our industry. And there's just so much to do. So thinking about this question before the interview, what I would like to recommend to people is to go to GFI website, gfi.org/ASAP. That's Advancing Solutions in Alternative Proteins. There's a whole list there. There's just so much to do. So that's my answer. Just go there on that website and make sure you read and understand. GFI has made such an amazing job in really pointing out the white spaces of our industry, and whoever works in these solutions will be able to build companies that have a significant competitive advantage from day one and that really advance our industry. So that would be my answer. There's a lot. And again, we also mentioned the continuous process in cultivated meat. I want to see that happening really fast.
Okay, got it. So if you are an aspiring entrepreneur and you want to send Beni a pitch deck for your new technology to grow animal cells in a continuous process, where should they send their pitch deck to, Beni? How do they get in touch with you?
So hello@mnhventures.com.
All right. We'll include that in the show notes for this episode, along with the GFI link that you suggested too.
Thank you.
Finally, Beni, you mentioned that you think people should read The Startup Nation. Other people, that's a very good book. I also endorse it. But you said there are a couple other books that you would recommend for people. Tell us, what should they be reading?
I think I was very influenced, probably as a lot of people, by *Sapiens* by Yuval Noah Harari. And then another book that Yuval Noah Harari was involved in, and that's *Clean Meat* by Paul Shapiro, which is a canonic book in our industry. Yes. And, it has a special place in my heart. I also have a signed copy that you made for me. So these, I think, are the most important books for me. I also know that you are fond of Calvin and Hobbes. So I don't know if it helps entrepreneurs, but I think it can give you a pretty good perspective on life and potential questions. So I also encourage people to look that up.
Very nice. Well, you're obviously a very erudite, very learned, very wise reader if you're recommending both Clean Meat and Calvin and Hobbes.
Yeah.
And surely it's very common for people to recommend both of those in the same breath. So I'm honored. And you're right. I am a big Calvin and Hobbes fan. I still remember in 1998 when Bill Watterson stopped publishing, what a blow I felt for that. And my girlfriend at the time got me a framed panel of the very last one. And it's definitely one of, the great, if not the greatest comic that has ever been published. So
agreed.
I'm very eager to endorse all of the books that you've recommended here. Startup Nation, *Sapiens*, *Clean Meat*, and every Calvin and Hobbes book ever written. So on that note, there's a lot to do. Go out, read these books, start your own continuous animal cell culture fermentation company, and get in touch with Beni. And he's looking forward to making a bet on you. So Beni, thanks so much for all you're doing to help advance the animal-free protein space. I'm rooting for your success.
Thank you so much, Paul.
Thanks for listening. I hope you found it useful, and if you did, please let the world know. Leave the show a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast app and share the episode with your friends. Who knows? Maybe you'll inspire one of them to be in the business of doing good themselves.